Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight's Research Tuesdays event, Democracy's Digital Demise. My name is Joanne Wallace, and I'm Professor of International Security in the Department of Politics and International Relations here at the University of Adelaide, and your MC for tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. With the digital world being a significant underpinning of our current society, we find there's an overwhelming amount of deceptiveness in the information available, which could threaten Australia's democratic status. Tonight we explore what the international influences are and how cyber antagonists are using digital information to affect numerous facets of Australian society, including moral and political division. By the end of tonight, we hope to highlight what tools and techniques the Australian public can use to build resilience in the community and prevent this influence from gaining further traction. Our speaker will deliver a short presentation followed by a Q&A session. Thank you to those who have submitted a question with your registration, and I encourage all our guests tonight to continue to submit questions during the presentation via the Q&A section down the bottom of your screen. I would now like to invite Tim on stage to start the night.
Many thanks, Joanne, and good evening to those of you watching from home and to those here in the small audience gathered amidst the COVID-19 restrictions. I'm very grateful to Research Tuesdays for giving me this public platform to engage with you and to outline some of the research that I have been doing with colleagues here at the university. And it's a valuable opportunity to be able to express and explain some of the social and political dimensions of the work that we're doing, because often in academia we can be limited in our audience engagement, and this is a great platform in which to explain the wider significance of the research that's been undertaken. And as you can see from my title, Democracy's Digital Demise, I'm not offering any small problem to handle or to think about. I'm offering something that's quite large and quite provocative. Coming away from this lecture and this talk, I hope that you feel that you not only have a better sense of the scale of the problem that I am going to argue that we're facing, but also perhaps a sense of what can be done about it in the present and into the future. And I've entitled this, subtitled this, Vulnerabilities and Resilience in Australia's Liberal Democracy, because it's not a bad news story. There is actually some good news in here as well. But nonetheless, good news doesn't mean that we should be complacent about our democracy. I think democracy itself, our liberal democracy, is one of the crowning achievements of contemporary society in Australia and elsewhere in the world, and something that we should protect and be vigilant about, given the face of growing threats to its legitimacy and our trust in those institutions of liberal democracy, which I shall explain during this lecture. I'm going to start with a short story. A true story. In early 2016 in the United States, on social media, Facebook in fact, a small group appears called Heart of Texas. It's a small Facebook group. You yourself may be part of many such groups on Facebook or other social media sites. This particular group, Heart of Texas, opens up its membership and starts inviting people to connect. And the basis of this group, it's a political group, is secessionism. The founding principle of the group was to say we want Texas to secede from the Union of the United States of America. Rather, we want an independent Texas, one which better represents the residents of Texas. And this group starts to grow in size. And over 2016, it starts to make some claims about what Texas should look like in terms of its social makeup, in terms of perhaps the freedoms of religion, or perhaps limiting some religions. Indeed, Islam was one of the religions identified by this Facebook group as being a threat to the values of Texas. And it grows. This organization grows increasingly and starts to organize real-world events, calling on its followers to attend protests, to organise their own protests, their own distribution of pamphlets and leaflets, and hopefully to stoke up enough political support for a for an independent Texas. At one point, this group reaches 250,000 followers, which at that time was more followers than both the Republican and Democrat parties of Texas. One problem. It was revealed that this Facebook group, Heart of Texas, was in fact controlled by an organisation called the Internet Research Agency based in St. Petersburg in Russia. So the implications were quite clear once this was revealed, that an organisation controlled potentially by a foreign entity was directly interceding in the US. At that time, the US presidential election was in full swing, but also in US politics, calling for secession of Texas. Now, this is a clear political move, a clear political organisation which ostensibly sought to take a domestic political issue and amplify it into something of extreme political significance for the United States. Now, this issue itself stokes concern both in the United States but for everyone globally, and not least, I argue, it should stoke concern for us here in Australia, and I'll explain why. Let me just give you a bit more of a background on who is undertaking this project and who I am, and perhaps a bit more structure around the problem and how we're going to address it. My name is Tim Legrand, as I've already been kindly introduced. My background is in political science and public policy, and I do work around national security and the Five Eyes and transgovernmentalism and things like that. And also in the project team is Dr. Melissa Ellen Downing, who's the research fellow and the engine behind this research. Sadly, she's not accompanying me on the stage, but hopefully you'll be able to see her influence throughout this project, as she really is the engine, as I say, behind its findings. And her background is in international relations and history, with specialism in Russian politics, foreign interference, and national security, and our contact details are there. Our approach to this project is to think about the insecurity that has crept into our democracy. What we're concerned about and what we want to find out is what vulnerabilities, particularly to a form of democracy, which is participatory democracy, that is emerging in Australia and other places in the world, and what vulnerabilities have been introduced by the digital public sphere, largely in democracies around the world, but also as they pertain to Australia, and whether there's possibilities to rectify those vulnerabilities. We're also concerned with the question of how adversaries, I've got to say like adversaries, there's a whole range of different entities out there in the world, beyond our borders and within our borders. Some are legitimate and are transparent in their intentions to transform democracy or to change the way things happen. Others are malign and hidden and perhaps non-transparent and try and seek political outcomes which are not in the interests of the country. So we ask, how do those adversaries, the illegitimate adversaries, theorise the causal mechanisms of information warfare being the broad gamut of mechanisms in the digital sphere or the digital landscape to provoke various advantages to those malign entities. How do they theorise those causal mechanisms, and how accurate are their models of our democratic processes? If we answer these questions effectively, we think, we can hopefully mobilise a whole range of Australian domestic expertise on socio-political relationships to map out, to identify and risk assess the structural vulnerabilities in Australia's democratic system. In doing so, we believe that we can develop best practices in systematically identifying and rectifying those vulnerabilities as they emerge, and thereby contributing to resilient democratic institutions. As I say, at the heart of this is a concern about protecting our democracy. These lectures, as academics I want to do, can go on and become quite wordy and complex, and perhaps you would prefer to have the argument up front in a nutshell. So here it is. Today's argument in a nutshell is this. That firstly, I think that the power of narrative, storytelling, discourse and argument are becoming central to the quality of democracies, how people talk about the problems that they have and how they seek to fix those problems. And specifically in participatory democracies, where citizens are increasingly becoming part of the decision-making processes of government, local, federal, and state. Secondly, the rapid digitization of our democratic institutions, our systems and processes, I argue, has induced a series of vulnerabilities, especially vulnerabilities for foreign antagonists. And that foreign kind of element is problematic, I know, but we can return to that later on. Has induced a series of vulnerabilities to exploit via interference to pursue, which is pursued partly, but not necessarily exclusively, by digital means. Thirdly, I argue we don't yet know enough about these vulnerabilities, though we're trying to map them. We don't know how they may be exploited and the consequences of them. But we do know that the central axioms of liberal democracy and participatory democracy are themselves at risk. Therefore, I conclude by arguing that we urgently need to fill these gaps in knowledge by mapping out the nascent digital dimensions of our democracy, so that we might go on to enhance the resilience of our democratic systems. No small ambition, but research should indeed be ambitious. So let's begin with some very broad brushstrokes, and I'll offer this caveat ahead of the presentation, that much of what I'm going to be talking about today is in broad brushstrokes. I'm going to be making some fairly broad assertions about the nature of democracy and the dynamics of democracy, and areas in which academics and commentators dedicate their entire lives to understanding the detail of. Because we only have half an hour today, I'm going to try and be as brief as I can, acknowledging that I'm making some fairly broad stretches in my summaries of those dynamics. So let's start with some liberal democratic principles. Liberalism requires us to protect things like the rule of law. The rule of law is at the heart of liberal democracy, the principle that nobody is above the rule of law. Liberal democracy requires us to live in a pluralised society in which difference is respected, is embraced, is acknowledged. And in that difference, people are all included, irrespective of their ethnicity, of their politics, of their class, of their background. That a liberal democracy requires a plurality of views which are included in decision-making processes. Liberal democracy requires us to respect that. Our institutions in liberal democracy are central, of course, because they run the democracy. They represent our interests on our behalf. So we have a legislature and a separation of powers. We have an executive and we have a judiciary, an impartial and independent judiciary. We have an independent public service. We have a series of political parties who organise different sorts of political interests and represent those within the democratic process itself. And we have, of course, at large civil society, the public sphere. You at home, me, everyone here who has their own idea about their interests and how those interests can and should be achieved through the political process. Now, participating in that political process is important. Now, there's two forms of democracy, largely in the liberal democratic way of thinking, and that's the representative form and the participatory form. I'm going to be bold and just focus today on the participatory form because I believe that is indeed the future of our democracy. And participatory democracy refers to the increasing tendency of citizens to be directly involved in the decision-making processes that affect their interests. That might be through a whole range of different mechanisms and processes, but those are particularly relevant in a digital age. And I'll come on to that later on. But there's two elements which I see as being integral to a participatory democracy. And that is a founding trust in democratic institutions, that our democratic institutions are set up to act on our behalf and do so fairly and impartially. The second quality is that of legitimacy. And that's a belief in the veracity of those processes. I'll explain those on the next slide a bit more clearly. But in the participatory dimension, we see a whole range of new ways in which you, me, us are able to directly represent our interests and our views of how society should be shaped through elections. Now, that's a standard representative model. Through referenda, again, a standard representative model, but also through petitions, increasingly digital petitions. You could see Kevin Rudd's recent petition calling for an inquiry into the power of the Murdoch press as an example of a form of participatory democracy. Public consultations, legal challenge, town hall meetings, but ways in which the connection between the citizens and decision makers are shortened. It's all about participation, enhancing our ability to get involved where that's possible. And this partly relies on, in fact heavily relies on, a free media, a media that is unimpeded in its capacity to report what it sees as the relevant news, or the truth, if you like. Now there's a loaded term. So let's return just for a moment to what I think are two integral parts of liberal democracy. I call these the crown jewels because I think without these two things, the whole system falls apart. Indeed, economists talk about trust as being an integral part of the economic system. Now, I'm drawing here on some work by Pierre Rosin-Vallon, who argues that trust represents what he calls an invisible institution. That without trust, we lose a lot of the qualities of what makes our democracy effective and make it run. And he says it's a property of a relationship between persons and groups, or groups. For example, between governors and governed. We have to build that relationship, maintain it, and guarantee that relationship of trust if we are to maintain our liberal democracy. Having trust allows governments and the governed and the governors to rule by consent. Now, if you have a policing background, you'll understand this instinctively, that largely the model of policing that we have in liberal democracy, set up by Sir Robert Peel, is one of consent, that police require the public to accept the legitimacy of the police as an enforcing body for them to be effective, rather than using coercion. And that goes for government as well, that we require a level of trust in our government that they are acting broadly, impartially and fairly without resorting to subjugation of our interests or coercion of the population to arrive at something like a consensual system of government. Underpinning this as well, and related intimately with trust, is legitimacy. And legitimacy is a quality that we ascribe to decisions made through democratic institutions and processes. And this idea of legitimacy is a belief that political outcomes have been arrived at fairly, appropriately, and proportionately, even or especially if the outcomes do not align with one's own interests or preferences. For example, Australia's a great sporting nation. It's not great at cricket, but it's pretty good at everything else. And the value and the quality of our participation in sports is always affected by the legitimacy of the outcomes, the adherence to the rules of the game. And where the rules of the game are not deemed to have been applied fairly, the result is often deemed to be illegitimate. We complain and throw water at the referee or whatever because if we see decisions being made unfairly or rules being applied in part with favour to one side, we see the results as illegitimate. Legitimacy underpins the rules of the game, how those rules are understood and how they are applied. This is the work largely ascribed to Fritz Scharpf, who talks about qualities of input and output legitimacy. And legitimacy being something that is decisions are legitimate to the extent that they have the input of the citizenry and that the output of those decisions align with the interests of the citizenry. And he argues that legitimacy then falls into this idea of being a socially sanctioned obligation to comply with government policies, even if these violate the actor's own interests or normative preferences. So even when decisions go against what I want, I can respect those decisions because I see the process by which they are arrived at as being fair and legitimate. I say that's a fair process, even if it's not one that I wanted, the outcome that I wanted. And that goes to things like elections. We require everyone to have a trust in the democratic process of elections to respect the outcome, even if it is the party elected that we ourselves don't like. So this idea of legitimacy and trust collapse into one another, fall into one another, and require us to hold a common belief that the system in which we are governed occupies a place of impartiality and fairness. Now, I think there's some problems emerging around our quality of participatory democracy. Now, we know that participatory democracy increases tolerance, reciprocity, and public understanding of their interests. When we participate in processes, we know that we feel better about ourselves. We feel better about our knowledge of the system and its outcomes. And authors such as John Dryzak and Carolyn Hendricks, both in Canberra, are working towards innovating new ways in which we can deliberate, and citizens can be part of a deliberative democracy in terms of deliberating what interests should be represented in a political process, and increasing thereby the quality of public democratic interactions. But we know there are several trends, but there's three trends that are starting to run counter to the quality of participatory democracy. First is that we know that there's low levels or declining levels of political participation in orthodox processes, especially for young people. We also know that year on year there are declining levels of trust in democratic institutions. Democracy 2025, an organisation in Canberra, have tracked this declining levels of trust in Australia, and they show that empirically people are showing less trust in Australia's institutions. And as I just referred to, we're increasingly seeing this ongoing legitimacy problem. And that perhaps feeds into the rest of this presentation, that the provenance and transparency of the inputs into democratic decision-making are increasingly uncertain in the digital sphere. What is this digital sphere? What is digital government? Well, since around 2002, 2003, we see emerging trends towards digitising governments. That the democracy that we live in and the government services and the way in which government engages with the citizens is increasingly being digitised. This is what Patrick Dunlevy and colleagues call digital era governance, that we are in an era in which our relationship with governments is mediated through the digital sphere. And this goes to not just the way in which services are delivered and information about us collected, but also in the ways in which we can participate in government decision making. We'll explore that in a moment. But digitisation as a trend is only increasing, only becoming deeper, faster and wider in its implications for your political life and mine. Especially in democracy, we have a digital transformation agency who are leading the federal government's efforts to digitise across the federal government. So by 2025, the federal government has committed to a whole-of-government ICT strategy for automation, looking to automate where possible government services to make data flow more easily between government services, to make effectively your interaction with government a one-stop shop. That you have a one window of interaction with government and it collects all the information it needs and shares that amongst government organs to provide you with the services that are tailored for you. It's efficiency on a scale that was previously unanticipated by any government pre-digital era. And you can see this through things like your education records becoming digitised, your health records becoming digitised, social security payments being digitised, public engagement being digitised. This delivers services and engagement quickly for a lower cost and, it is hoped, for lower risk, although I think that that might be optimistic. So, against this broad backdrop, what are we facing? Well, part of the problem that I see is one of structure. That's our democratic systems were designed in an analogue era, pre-digital era. So in the 1990s, we see public engagement between government and citizens as being analogue, slow, loosely networked, very localised. If you lived in cities in particular, you had much greater access to decision making because you were closer to the seat of power. In that era, democratic institutions relied on an implicit assumption, which nobody really challenged, that any citizen inputs into decision making were largely authentic. We didn't worry about whether a real person was saying a real thing because they were there in front of us. This was a system which was relatively resistant to synthetic or fake inputs, though these still existed. We move into the digital era governance, and we see a reversal of these trends, that public engagement is increasingly digital, it's fast, it's tightly connected, and it's global. There is, we live in what's been called the borderless world. That's those who participate and have input into any sort of digital conversation, whether that's on social media or otherwise, can be local or they can be global. And against this backdrop, we see fragmenting and multiplying inputs to decision making. And with this complexity, we see, I argue, a reduced transparency in inputs and decision making. Who do we know is participating in these processes, and are we sure that they're an authentic individual? Authentic being someone with a legitimate interest, either being a citizen of a country, a permanent resident, or even just somebody living here. Now, that authenticity problem can be framed and will be framed better by lawyers and by constitutional specialists. But certainly we know that there are plenty of actors out there who you might say do not have a direct legitimate stake in our democracy, and yet might play into those processes. And within this space, of course, is digital media. The social media realm that is now very much part of our day-to-day lives is involved in creating, driving and shaping political narratives. And for those of you who have seen the Netflix documentary The Social Dilemma, you'll have a fair idea of the dynamics and the problems associated with that. An additional problem that has been identified by political scientists is that of polarization and extreme rights politics. Polarization across the globe is on the rise, is increasing even, and perhaps you might say especially, in liberal democratic societies. You might say that the polarization that we've seen in the United States is largely symbolic of those sorts of debates and dynamics that are playing out elsewhere as well, in Spain, in France, in Germany, in the UK, where I'm from. This is a global challenge that authors such as Carruthers and O'Donoghue argue is part of a democratic recession globally. And the rise of illiberal politics is certainly palpable. The leadership of people like Donald Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Viktor Orban in Hungary or any number of strongman leaders, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin. These are real actors who are endorsing and part of a move towards illiberal politics globally. And polarization is deemed to weaken respect for democratic norms, to corrode basic legislative processes, undermine the non-partisan status of the judiciary, as we've particularly seen in the UK over the past 2 years. It fuels public disaffection with political parties and exacerbates intolerance and discrimination. Polarization is a real challenge to those qualities of inclusion and pluralism that, as I argued earlier, are part of our liberal democratic system. At the same time, we see extreme right politics on the rise. This is not something that you require a degree in political science to notice. ASIO have drawn attention to the rapid rise of far-right extremism in Australia, recently suggesting that up to 40% of its counter-terrorism cases involved far-right violent extremism. Earlier this year, Mike Burgess, the ASIO chief, noted the problems of the extreme right-wing online forums, such as The Base, which are not just Australian-oriented, but actually connected and tightly connected and networked with international groups of a similar political bent. These online forums, he said, share and promote extremist right-wing ideologies and encourage and justify acts of extreme violence. Recent research by Macquarie University, mapping networks and narratives of online right-wing extremists in New South Wales, reveals a similar dynamic in New South Wales, a rise of right-wing extremism promoting all sorts of division around society, including, narratives that challenge the fundamentals of pluralist liberal democracy through exclusivist, which is another way of saying perhaps fascist, appeals to race, ethnicity, nation and gender. This is about division, enhancing and upscaling polarization. And of course, central to this on the research that we're doing at the moment is that of foreign interference. That this is playing out against a backdrop of geostrategic interests. That illiberal governments elsewhere see these trends and see opportunity in these trends, not just globally, but here in Australia, although I'll be drawing particularly from examples overseas. Now, the goals of foreign interference, I think, are quite clear, that that for nation-states that seek to produce outcomes, political, geostrategic outcomes in their interests, this is a cheap and effective means of achieving those interests. Beneath the level of warfare, you can interrupt the processes of another country and produce from those processes the outcomes that you seek without firing a shot, without starting a war, and indeed by denying it. You can deny and say it wasn't us. So the goals of this could be things, the promotion of alternative ideologies and divisive politics. They can gain economic advantage through these means, or a competitive advantage in the global economy. They can coerce or co-opt decisions that benefit their states, or just generally acquire the interests or secure their own interests, whatever they may be. The strategies are quite well explored in many respects. These are the understanding the tactics themselves are the job of security agencies in Australia, which are doing a very good job of identifying many of these strategies. But largely, they go to things like the manipulation of social media platforms to disseminate messaging that accrues support for their targeted outcomes, or the digital intrusion into critical infrastructure, or indeed the use of mainstream media or clandestine means to control a country's political agenda. And this is all widely reported. I'm using a quote here from the 2017 ASIO annual report, which suggested that they had identified foreign powers seeking to shape the opinions of members of the Australian public, media organisations and government officials to advance their country's own political objectives. This is indeed old news. We know that this is happening at scale and on a continual basis here in Australia. Part of this effort is about critical infrastructure. We see that the digital landscape is a medium by which foreign antagonists are able to interrupt or degrade our critical infrastructure services, partly as a means to degrade Australia's economic performance or its political effectiveness, and a whole range of different other objectives. But we can see that it's a serious and growing threat from some of these news stories and what they suggest. The Australian Cyber Security Centre tracks these and sees a range of threats against businesses, against governments, ICT providers, and indeed against you as a home user. And they argue that foreign states still possess the greatest capability to compromise Australian networks. My concern and my interest is in how democratic processes themselves can be subjugated or affected or influenced by foreign antagonists. And a good example is that of Brexit. The 2016 referendum in the UK, which sought to determine whether the British public wanted to stay as a member of the EU or leave, was one of the most polarising issues to confront the British public since, in living memory. It was a rancorous debate, and the sharp divide was played out partly through online media and partly through the orthodox media. Now, in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, a parliamentary committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament, turned their attention to the possible foreign interference of Russia in that referendum campaign. And they found widespread evidence of the Russian government's online actions, which included a general poisoning of the political narrative in the West by fomenting political extremism and wedge issues, and by astroturfing of public opinion. And they argued, and they found that the UK, and particularly issues such as this, were clearly a target for Russian disinformation. That though the mechanics themselves of actual engagement, of voting themselves, the analogue processes of paper-based voting were largely secure, the prior context of opinion forming remained vulnerable. And they argued that social media companies should take action. This itself happened around the same time as the US presidential election, the runoff between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. We know that in the run-up to that election, that the Democratic National Congress, the DNC, Democratic National Committee, had their emails hacked into by hackers associated with the Russian government and released, causing chaos in the democratic campaign and leading to the resignation of the DNC's chair, their CEO and CFO. We also know that the social media around that time was brought into by foreign operatives seeking to promote Donald Trump's election, and this was a subject of a congressional inquiry which revealed many of the tactics and processes associated with that, especially those associated with social media such as Facebook. A third example is that of the mainstream media. That this is in 2017, and Qatar, as you may know, is a bit of a black sheep in the Middle East and is subject to lots of political pressure from its neighbouring states in terms of its politics and how it does business. In 2017, we saw its state-run news agency was hacked into, and a fake news article story was planted, which praised the ruling emir that quoted him as praising Hamas and describing Iran as an Islamic power. A very provocative and divisive story to plant. Indeed, it was discovered that it was planted, and indeed that this was part of an effort by a competitor state to degrade Qatar's reputation on the international stage. But this triggered, of course, a diplomatic crisis. Now, that's a mainstream media problem, but also one of the digital sphere, that we are readily admitting and willing to buy into the news that we see not only on social media but also on the mainstream media. So there's vulnerabilities across the spectrum. So let's start to think about this in the context of Australia, and what sorts of problems might we look to or might we anticipate in the future? Because we, much as Australia has a degree of tolerance and inclusivity to it, there are many divisive issues that we see out there. So there's, on the left, I've taken some divisive issues from the website isidewith.com.au, which looks at divisive issues in Australia. I welcome you to go and have a look at that website. And so these are identified here are, issues such as republicanism, very much a cleavage in Australian political opinion. Marriage equality, as we saw in the postal ballots, was certainly a hugely divisive political issue. Other issues such as asylum seekers or Indigenous constitutional recognition, climate change measures, health advice, these continue to be divisive social issues in Australia. At the same time, we can start to see some real vulnerabilities emerging in our democratic institutions. We're seeing efforts to hack into or collapse government digital services, such as the census a few years ago. We see that there's increasing online efforts in social media to amplify illiberal perspectives or politics, or particularly right-wing politics, provoking polarising politics and alternative social movements, which deny the legitimacy of the government to make decisions on our behalf. That trust as a whole in our democracy is seemingly on the slide. So these are vulnerabilities which we need to acknowledge and get ahead of, I argue. And this is how these play out in a conceptual sense. So we have, on the one hand, we have in Australia and elsewhere acute problems or acute issues that occur in the short term and require the Australian public to engage either in a decision or in a debate about what the outcome of that issue should be or how we should handle it. And we know that foreign interference technologies are able to interrupt in those discussions and in those participatory processes in decisions by disinformation or interruption in elections or referenda, interfering with the processes to cast doubt on outcomes, or by indeed blocking public interaction by arguing that people shouldn't participate in decision-making processes. This, I argue, is bound up in the erosion or the attempt to erode legitimacy of democratic outcomes, to diminish people's confidence and faith in how outcomes have been achieved. At the same time, we see a chronic, ongoing potentially a chronic, ongoing, long-term efforts to be divisive, to polarise, to upscale polarising issues in Australian democracy, to push out to the extremes the left versus the right. You know, we've seen this called the culture wars, in which the left and the right are becoming further and further apart and not having sufficient areas of overlap to be able to engage meaningfully in political debates. I think you, perhaps at home, might instinctively recognise this sentiment that there is a left and there is a right, and never the twain shall meet. I think this divisive political sentiments, which manifests sometimes in far-right political extremism, or you might even say, or according to Peter Dutton, is far-left extremism, if you think that exists. But certainly it refers to ongoing acceptance, if you like, of, you know, saying the unsayable, of decrying political correctness. But I think that in many respects is cover for racism and intolerance, or at least accepting racism and intolerance. And this goes to the polarisation of our society, and indeed the erosion of trust in democratic institutions. That those democratic institutions are taken over, they say, by do-gooders, or those who, you know, perhaps have let their social conscience run away with them or whatever. So rather, we can't trust the democratic processes to represent our interests anymore. And this is seen and pronounced through a range of polarising debates, from immigration, around intergenerational inequality, national identity, social rancour, and a whole range of different issues relevant there. And these contribute to the ongoing erosion of our values that promotes populism over the rule of law, polarisation over pluralism, and intolerance over inclusivity. In the research that we're doing, we're looking to map out, to reveal, hopefully, how we participate in Australia in our democracy. So this is very much the work of Melissa Ellen Dowling, who's started to tease out the whole range of ways in which the Australian federal government and state agencies start to interact, or have started to interact, directly with citizens through elections, referenda, plebiscites, postal surveys, parliamentary committees, petitions, consultations, protests, even the public sphere debates, a whole range of, on social media, on Twitter, a whole range of different ways and channels of engagement are being revealed through this work. And this is a summary of what is actually a much larger data set. And what we're finding is that there are both in Australia a hybridity of digital and analogue components of participation. Analogue being the formal turning up, the person being a physical, tangible presence in a participation. So rather than just emailing or going online to offer your thoughts about something, you turn up to a town hall meeting, or you write into your MP, and so on. Now, this hybridity is partly a result of the analogue era's structures of democracy, and in many senses, and we'll go on to see in a moment, runs side by side with digital participation. So what we're seeing emerging are some good news and bad news. On the good news side, we see that because of this hybridity, the levels of engagement and how people's inputs into policy making are understood and regarded are seen through the lens of real people. So real policy officials read the inputs and engagements of individuals. That is not automated, that there is a person behind every decision and every engagement with the public, which applies a common sense test against the inputs that they're reading. And so largely those analogue inputs which involve some levels of identity verification, are quite robust against levels efforts of foreign interference. So the way at the articulation stage, when people articulate a preference, there's very few problems associated with authenticating people's real opinions. But we argue, or we're starting to see, that at the preference formation stage, we're seeing problems emerging. That at the where we articulate our preferences in voting, there is very little interference and very little problems associated with authentic opinions. But how those opinions in the preference formation stage are affected is indeed a cause for concern, because at that stage where people are in the 5 hours, the 5 days, the 5 months, the 5 years prior to their decisions being articulated in a decision-making process, that is where their opinions can be transformed in the public sphere, in social media, and indeed in their discussions with their colleagues. So where preferences are themselves being shaped in the digital sphere, we see potential vulnerabilities. So towards the end of this presentation, I want to start to think about what the insecurities look like. We know that all democracies themselves are idiosyncratic, and Australia's no different. That we know that we have a unique and evolving combination of institutions, processes, and civil society, which in many ways introduces unique vulnerabilities to synthetic or inauthentic intrusions on our democratic processes. So for political scientists such as myself and Melissa Dowling, modelling foreign interference requires knowledge of not just the possible targets, but also knowledge of how the vulnerabilities in how society interacts with those institutions in separate democracies plays out. That, we think, lends greater urgency to mapping the hybrid digital analog democratic landscape. And in doing so, we can better understand and identify vulnerabilities, and thereby fix them. So to summarise today's talk, and I hope that you've kept pace with what's been a very broad brushstroke overview of the research. Now, Australia's hybrid digital mechanisms are part of our national security. Our democracy requires us to pay attention to how secure our processes are and how indeed those will evolve into the future. Preference articulation stages remain relatively secure, but preference formation stages are less certain. We do know that there are malign foreign entities out there which seek to target the Australian population before the interest articulation stage, and do so to increase the chances of their success. And this is a problem which is only going to get worse into the future. And so we argue that securing the discourses in the public sphere is going to be integral into the future of our liberal democracy. With that, thank you very much for your attention, and I believe we have some questions.
Okay, thank you, Tim. That was really excellent. I'd now like you to invite you to remain on camera to start the Q&A. Remember our audience to please submit any questions that you have via the Q&A section of the webinar. So Tim, our first pre-submitted question is, given the political polarisation occurring in the United States and the very real possibility that it's already happening here in Australia, what actual difficult political decisions and public discussions should we be having to ensure that our social fabric does not erode to the point of no return?
Thank you. It's a tough question. Polarisation, I think, is, as I've foreshadowed already in the presentation, is one of our greatest challenges today, and the growing separation of political views is something I think that we should try and reverse. Partly, I think we can appeal to the Australian public and ourselves to show greater engagement, or to engage more frequently with those of a political viewpoint, to bridge that polarising divide and to bring politics back into something like a central ground where meaningful dialogue and debate can be heard. So to go past what we might call the dialogue of the deaf. I think that partly requires our society to have a mind for critical thinking, to look at the problems of society as they're presented to them and not accepting them uncritically, but to look at issues through perhaps their own lens and to understand perhaps the biases and the interests that are out there in promoting certain narratives and certain issues. So I think critical thinking is important. I also think that we need to be much more demonstrative about the decision-making processes. Now, I think people lose confidence in how decisions are made, and so look for alternative forms of participation. So I think in terms of our democratic institutions, we need to be much more demonstrative about the transparency in decision making. That once the public are more able to see how decisions are arrived at, they're more likely, as I argue, to ascribe those the outcomes of those decisions as legitimate.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Next pre-submitted question is, this battle is for control over ideas. Can we be inoculated by better education, or is this a permanent chink in democracy's armour?
Indeed, it is a battle of ideas, and you might trace back the ongoing ideological battles to the beginning of the states. You know, that since the birth of the states, we've seen people seek control of the states through, my politics is better than yours. That, political dialogue and debates is central to democracy itself. But in respect of the question, like, can we inoculate people to malign ideas? Well, yes and no. Well, to the extent that once we understand the range of interests out there, and again, this goes to the transparency argument that I make. Once we understand what people's interests are in making certain claims, then you're more equipped to make an assessment of whether or not their interests or the issues as they present them are valid, or indeed in your interests. When entities present issues and you are unaware of their interests, or perhaps their hidden agenda, then you are not in a position to make an informed assessment of their intent. So this again goes to authenticity, that once I think we should look to a democratic sphere in which those who are participating are transparent in their participation, whether that's real people or real companies or real governments.
Okay, and our final pre-submitted question is, many actors threaten our liberal democratic institutions and processes. Why focus on the foreign ones? Aren't domestic motives a much larger threat?
Very good question. My first academic answer to this would be, I can't do everything. On this project, we are focused on foreign and ostensibly malign interests from beyond our borders. But I acknowledge that certainly within our borders, there are a whole range of what you might say are inappropriate interests seeking to gain their, to achieve their own political goals, and perhaps do so in ways which are antithetical to democracy. So that could be, you might be talking about lobbyists or industries which perhaps shouldn't be given the subsidies or the political support that they do get. And I would agree that there's far too much of that in Australia, and you might say that even in many respects that is the larger problem. It's not the problem that we're addressing on this, but certainly some of the insights that we're developing are transferable across to a more transparent and legitimate democratic process.
Yeah, I do wonder whether the problem is that the politicians themselves have an interest in maintaining to a degree the system as it is. So the very people that have interests in it are the ones that are being asked to change it.
Yes, I mean, cynically and accurately, I'd say. You might say that the reason that Russian disinformation worked in the United States in 2016 was because they backed the winner, who then had no interest in going back and revealing the level. And you might say the same for Brexit as well, that Boris Johnson has refused to undertake any extensive government inquiry into potential Russian disinformation because you might cynically say, but accurately, that the outcome was in the interests that he sought to pursue. So.
Well, this just goes to show how relevant this research is, and I look forward to watching it unfold. So I'd like to finish by thanking tonight's speaker, Associate Professor Tim Legrand, for the insightful and interesting presentation. And thank you all to our audience for viewing and for your questions and comments. Once the official event proceedings are over, Tim will jump onto Zoom to answer a few more questions. So this has been our October edition of Research Tuesdays, Democracy's Digital Demise. Next month is our final Research Tuesday topic. For information on November's topic, head to the Research Tuesdays website, where you can also sign up to find out latest information. We hope you'll join us again. Thank you all for viewing, and remember to stick around tonight to chat to Tim. Good night.
Hello there, folks, and thank you very much for those of you who wish to join me for a short Q&A session. And I've seen that there's a few questions that have popped up already, and I'll try and address as many as I can in the time that we have available. I'll begin with the first one, and thank you to Wayne Boardman for this one, who asks, do you think that the coronavirus pandemic has diminished the analog processes and increased the speed of take-up of the digitization process? I mean, that's an excellent question, Wayne, and I think there's several ways in which I could offer an answer to that. I think the first is that I don't see I think there's no doubt that governments are seeing the benefits, certainly, of digitization in the current era, largely because people have been forced to work from home, and the delivery of digital services has never been more important than it is now, especially while people are working from home, but also children are learning, doing their schoolwork from home, and so on. So I think the pandemic has demonstrated the advantages and the benefits of a digital society, and perhaps has lent some weight to the argument that we need to enhance our digital infrastructure, enhance digital services, and become much more a smart digital society. Now, I think that is undoubtedly and largely a good thing. And let me just pitch for a moment for a better national broadband network, and hopefully the government will listen and enhance our services and the speed at which digitization across Australia can be set out, because we do obviously benefit quite largely from a digital infrastructure that we do have. So in the question of, perhaps the question of the negative dimensions of the coronavirus pandemic in respect of digital society, I think it's revealed some really interesting and certainly quite frightening dynamics. I mean, you don't need to look too far to see the amount of conspiracy theories that have flourished in social media as a result of coronavirus. People associating the spread of the virus with 5G networks, for example. This is the clearest demonstration, if you like, of the power of social media and the confidence that people have in the facts as they are presented to them. I say facts, but I'm putting little bunny ears around facts, because this is a problem of fake news and diminishing trust in expertise. That people don't trust experts, nor indeed do they trust government to be telling them the truth on things such as public health. So that, I think, is one of the worrying dimensions of our digital society to have emerged from the coronavirus. Okay, thank you, Wayne. I hope that's a satisfying answer. Let's move on. Hayley Pierce asks, how responsible are current political representatives in the polarization of civil society? Good question, Hayley. I mean, I don't want to name names, because I don't think my opinion is as important as your own opinion. And I would suggest that each of us has a responsibility for assessing whether our political representatives gain a political advantage by polarizing debates, by eschewing complex and difficult negotiations with people from different political viewpoints, and instead preferring a unilateral shout out of their own political view. I think that polarizing dimension is simplistic and it's easy, and I think many political representatives play to what they know resonates with their base support, potentially. And they know that some tropes and some stereotypes play quite well. And I think in all parts of the political spectrum, often political representatives can be lazy in the political discourses that they resort to, and the easy ones are the ones I think that are most often polarizing. I would suggest that a mature democracy is one in which our political representatives not only recognise the fallibility of their own political viewpoints, but also realise that there is strength in negotiating and engaging with those of a different political viewpoints, not resorting to ad hominem attacks, as we often see in Australia, and acknowledging that politics and the way in which we administer our society is difficult. It's complex, and often politicians get it wrong, but that's not a reason to condemn one another for it. So I think that maturity is something that we're lacking. It'd be nice to see a little more of it. Thank you, Hayley. I hope that answers your question. Crispin Vauxhall asks, provocatively asks, although we treasure our rights to vote, in fact in Australia it's not only our right, it's our obligation to vote, actually very few people truly understand the complexity of government. Can we still justify allowing everyone the right to vote in a system they do not understand? Crispin, it may not surprise you that I reject that particular viewpoint. That is a pathway to a very problematic form of government, whereby you argue that only a narrow proportion of people are bright enough to govern, and therefore everyone else should be deprived
of their capacity to have a say. I think that that path is certainly provocative as a question, but it's one that runs counter to the central axioms of democracy, that everybody has an interest in their democracy and should have a right to have a say in how it's run, because without a pluralized society, we live in a potentially a populist or one-eyed society. And I think that that's a good thing, and one thing that Australia has done quite well over the past few years. Just moving on, I've got to kind of read and answer the questions at the same time, so do bear with me as I kind of go through these. So let's pick another one. Do we need a better critical thinking, evidence-based processes in all members of the public? And how do we do this? It should be taught in schools and universities in more detail so that all people can have the tools to make clear decisions that affect them. Well, the answer to that is absolutely yes. Now, our schools and our education system here and our universities do teach critical thinking. I think our teachers do a spectacular job of educating our young minds and teaching them the value of assessing evidence and how you assess evidence. And that form of education continues up through high school and into university. Indeed, some of my students are listening into this conversation now, and hopefully they can attest to how often I insist on their critical view. I insist on them taking my views to task and disputing everything I teach them, because I think the value of a strong education is one in which you can cast doubts on the things that you are given to understand about the world and arrive at your own perspective on what they mean. Now, that's not to say that any view goes, but it is to say that a society which is open to a plurality of views and tolerant of those views is one that is resistant to populism, resistant to intolerance, and is much more inclusive. So I think that's a good thing. I think critical thinking is something that we do need much more of. I will say, and you'll all know this already, that the recent transformation of the government's funding of the arts, of arts degrees, certainly doesn't help matters, because it discourages students from taking an arts degree in which critical thinking is the very bedrock of our degree, and indeed especially affecting young women who want to take those degrees. So that's my view. I will take another question to finish off. Let's go down to, I'm sorry, I do have to cherry pick ones that I think I can answer meaningfully and usefully for you all. Okay, the question here, Russia is influencing the US, this is Paul Boundy, Russia is influencing the US and UK processes and maybe Australia. Is Australia trying to influence Russia? And then a second question, ABC Four Corners painted Putin badly, so is this ethical? Well, two separate questions, I'll answer the first one. Russia is influencing US and UK processes and maybe Australia. This isn't just about Russia, although I think the Russian government is very clearly involved in very extensive and sophisticated forms of interference in liberal democracies. I think I'll tell you why first, or I'll give you my speculation as to why Russia is involved in this. And you just need to look at Belarus as a good example as to the outlook of an illiberal regime such as Putin's. Now, the outlook there is the competitor ideology to illiberalism is liberalism, is liberal democracy. And to the extent possible, the illiberal democracies or illiberal states seek to surround themselves with like-minded regimes. This is Putin's interest in Belarus. Not only that Belarusians are themselves very similar to Russians ethnically and in terms of their traditions and culture, but that they themselves have been under an illiberal regime for a very long time. And so the possible revolution there in Belarus, or the popular protests against the regime which is resisting the results of the recent elections, is emblematic on an illiberal view of a potential erosion of like-minded states. And so for illiberal regimes, not just Russia, but other states as well, part of the goal of their interference in liberal democracies is to weaken those liberal democracies and weaken their claims to being a competitive alternative ideology to the one that they themselves hold. That's my view. I don't think it's actually a controversial view, but it is my view. So is Australia trying to influence Russia? Now, I think the answer is yes. I'm an academic. I don't have high security clearances, so there's nothing I can say that has any specific revelation in terms of national security, not least because I'm a POM and I don't think they trust me enough anyway to give you a security clearance. I think that all Western countries are doing their best. No, maybe not their best, actually. That's putting it too boldly. I think they are making efforts to promote liberal democracy. Sometimes they do it poorly. I think sometimes they do it well. But Australia, amongst other Western countries, are indeed advocating around the world the values and the strengths of liberal democracy. What goes with that is a whole range of benefits around, citizen rights and serving, being able to have meaningful participation in your governments. Human rights go along with liberal democracy very often, and a better life. Of all the options available to us, liberal democracy seems to be the best one that we've come up with so far. And so I think indirectly, all liberal democracies are demonstrating and doing their best to support any country that tries to head towards liberal democratic ways of rule. Do I think that means that Australia is directly doing that in Russia? I don't think there are any, as far as I know, any covert operations to spread liberal democracy. I think the internet is probably the best mechanism we already have to spread the news or the insights into how liberal democracies play out. And I think any effort any government tries beyond that will pale in significance. It might not be a very satisfying answer, but I hope it was useful. Well, that brings me to the end of tonight's Q&A and the session today. I thank you very much all for attending. I hope that you found this interesting. Feel free to email me or Melissa if you've got questions or inputs into our research. It's a research project that will carry on for another, at least for the foreseeable future. And we look forward to producing lectures and outputs along these lines in the future for you. Many thanks and good evening to you all.